She had heard it all before. The doubts, the dismissive smiles, the warnings disguised as advice. This isn't your place. People like you don't make it in this world. Stay in your lane. At first, she tried to ignore it. She told herself it didn't matter what they thought, that her talent and determination would speak louder than their expectations. But the more she pushed forward, the more resistance she faced. It wasn't just about proving herself. It was about breaking through walls that weren't meant to be broken, about stepping into a space where no one had made room for her. Every time she took a step forward, someone was there to remind her she didn't belong. At meetings, they barely acknowledged her. When she spoke, they nodded politely, but moved on as if her words carried no weight. When she presented ideas, they were met with forced smiles, only to be repackaged and repeated by someone else, someone they actually listened to. She worked twice as hard, stayed twice as late, poured everything she had into proving them wrong. But it never seemed to be enough. No matter how much she accomplished, there was always an unspoken rule holding her back. She thought about walking away. Many times. What was the point of fighting a battle that had already been decided? But every time she reached that breaking point, something inside her refused to quit. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. So, she kept going. At first, the changes were small. A subtle shift in how people looked at her, a moment of hesitation before they dismissed her completely. Then, little by little, the cracks in their certainty started to show. She started winning. Not because they let her, but because she forced them to see her. And then, something happened. Something that changed everything. She wasn't just playing their game anymore. She was rewriting the rules. And they never saw it coming. She still remembered the first time she realized the rules weren't made for her. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no grand confrontation. It was something quieter, something that settled deep inside her, a realization that no matter how much she excelled, no matter how much she proved herself, there would always be someone ready to remind her that she wasn't meant to be here. It started early. In school, when she spoke up with ideas only to be overlooked in favor of louder voices. At her first job, when she worked harder than everyone else, but still got passed over for opportunities. And now here, where she had fought so hard to earn a place, only to find that the biggest battle had just begun. She had spent years watching how things worked, studying the people who were already where she wanted to be. They had confidence, connections, an unshakable belief that they belonged. No one questioned them. No one asked if they were sure they could handle the responsibility. They walked into rooms expecting to be heard. She had tried to be like them. She had mimicked their confidence, studied their mannerisms, even adjusted the way she spoke to fit in. But no matter what she did, she always felt like an outsider looking in, like she was waiting for someone to realize she wasn't supposed to be there. And then she realized something else. They weren't better than her. They weren't smarter, more capable, or more deserving. The only difference was that they had never been told to stay in their lane. They had never been made to feel like they needed permission to take up space. So she stopped waiting for permission. At first, no one noticed. She started speaking up more, making decisions without looking for approval. She took risks that others wouldn't, pushed for changes that made people uncomfortable. The resistance was immediate. Some people dismissed her outright, acting as if she wasn't even in the room. Others smiled and nodded, but made sure to block her progress when it mattered. She saw the subtle ways they tried to push her back into place, the way they closed doors she hadn't even realized she was knocking on. But she didn't stop. She worked harder, not just to prove herself, but to understand the system she was fighting against. She watched who had power, how decisions were made, what really mattered beneath the surface. And then she started playing by her own rules. She built her own connections, found allies in unexpected places. She learned how to navigate the politics, how to push just enough to be heard, without being labeled difficult. She made herself impossible to ignore. The first time they took credit for her work, she let it go. The second time, she called it out calmly, directly, in a way that made it impossible for them to brush off. People started paying attention, not just to her work, but to her. And then, something happened that changed everything. A project bigger than anything she had worked on before. The kind of opportunity that could change the course of her career. The kind of opportunity they had never let someone like her have before. She wasn't supposed to get it, but she did. And that's when the real fight began. The moment it was announced, she felt the shift. Some congratulated her, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Others didn't even bother hiding their skepticism. And then there were those who saw her as a threat, people who had spent years controlling the game and weren't about to let her change the rules. She knew what was coming. The subtle sabotage, the whispered doubts, the impossible expectations. They were waiting for her to fail. What they didn't know was that she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. And this time, she wasn't backing down. She knew the moment she accepted the project that it wouldn't be easy. But she hadn't expected the resistance to come so quickly, or from so many directions. At first, it was small things. Emails that mysteriously never reached her, meetings scheduled without her knowledge. When she asked questions, she was met with vague answers, half-truths designed to keep her one step behind. She wasn't just fighting for her place anymore, she was fighting to keep the opportunity she had already earned. The people around her weren't all enemies, but she couldn't tell who was truly on her side. Some offered words of encouragement, but when it came time to act, they hesitated. Others watched from a distance, waiting to see if she would sink or swim before deciding where their loyalty lay. Then there were those who made their position clear. They didn't need to say it outright. It was in the way they dismissed her ideas, the way they questioned her expertise, while accepting lesser work from others. It was in the way they made her feel like she was constantly one mistake away from proving them right. She worked harder, pushed herself further, but no matter how much progress she made, it felt like there was always a force pulling her back. The pressure was relentless. The expectations were impossible. But then something happened that changed everything. She wasn't sure when she first noticed it, the subtle shift in the way people spoke about her. The way they started using her name in conversations that once excluded her. The way people who had once ignored her now watched her carefully, as if they were trying to figure out how she had managed to get this far. She had become a problem, and they were looking for a way to fix it. The first real attempt to shut her down came in the form of a mistake, one she hadn't even made. A miscalculation in a report, something small but significant enough for them to use against her. She caught it before it could do any damage, but the message was clear. They were waiting for her to fail. She became more careful, double-checking everything, anticipating every possible obstacle. But no matter how prepared she was, they kept finding new ways to make things harder. Resources she needed suddenly became unavailable. Approvals took longer than usual. Decisions were made without her input, even when she was the one leading the project. She realized then that this wasn't just about her. It was about control. They didn't want her to succeed, not because she wasn't capable, but because if she did, it would change everything. It would prove that the system they had built, the one that kept people like her out, wasn't as unshakable as they believed. She thought about quitting more times than she could count. The exhaustion, the constant battle, it would be so much easier to walk away. But then she remembered why she had started in the first place. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving herself right. So she kept going. And that's when she realized she wasn't the only one fighting this battle. There were others, people who had faced the same obstacles, the same unspoken rules designed to keep them in their place. Some had given up. Some had learned to survive by staying quiet. And some, just like her, were ready to push back. She wasn't alone. And that changed everything. The more she pushed forward, the more resistance she met. It wasn't just the little things anymore: lost emails, delayed approvals, passive-aggressive remarks in meetings. Now it was outright obstruction. Decisions she had made were being overturned without explanation. The people who had once supported her were growing distant, their silence speaking louder than words. She had expected challenges, but this was something else. It was as if someone had decided she had come far enough, and now they were doing everything in their power to make sure she didn't go any further. But she didn't stop. She worked late into the night, double and triple checking her work. Every detail had to be perfect, every strategy airtight. She refused to give them a single excuse to question her. And yet, no matter how much she prepared, they always found a new way to make things harder. Then came the rumors. Small at first, whispers that she wasn't qualified, that she had only gotten this far because of luck or favors. She heard them in passing, saw the shift in the way people looked at her. Doubt was a powerful weapon, and they were using it against her. She wanted to ignore it, to keep her head down and focus on the work. But pretending it wasn't happening wouldn't make it stop. She had seen this tactic before: discredit, isolate, push out. It was a pattern, one that had been used against others before her, and she refused to let it happen again. She started speaking up, challenging decisions that had been made behind closed doors, forcing conversations that people wanted to avoid. Some admired her boldness. Others resented it. The tension in the room whenever she walked in was almost tangible now. Then came the biggest blow yet. A meeting was called, one she hadn't been invited to. By the time she found out, it was already over. Decisions had been made, ones that directly affected her work, ones she should have been part of. She felt the weight of it, the cold realization that no matter how hard she fought, they were still trying to push her out. She could feel it slipping away, everything she had worked for, everything she had fought to build. But then something happened that changed everything. A mistake not hers this time, but theirs. In their rush to silence her, they had overlooked something, a small detail that unraveled everything they had been trying to hide. And now she had the advantage. For the first time since this fight began, they weren't the ones in control, and they had no idea what was coming next. She stared at the evidence in front of her, her pulse racing. It was a small detail, something they had overlooked in their desperation to shut her out, but it was enough. Enough to prove that they had been working against her. Enough to turn the tables in her favor. But just as she started to form a plan, something unexpected happened. Someone else knew. She hadn't told anyone yet, hadn't had the chance to figure out her next move. But the next morning, she found an anonymous message waiting for her. No name, no explanation, just a single sentence. "You're not the only one watching." A chill ran down her spine. Whoever sent it, they knew what was happening. They knew what she had found. But the real question was, were they warning her, or were they trying to stop her? She tried to focus, tried to stay on track, but everything was shifting too fast now. The people who had once ignored her were suddenly paying attention, watching her every move. Conversations stopped when she walked into a room. Emails that had once taken days to get a response were now answered in minutes. And then, just as quickly as things started turning in her favor, the real backlash began. An emergency meeting was called. This time, she was invited, but she knew what it was. They weren't bringing her in to hear her side. They were bringing her in to corner her, to force her into a decision that would take her out of the game for good. She walked into the room knowing exactly what they were trying to do. The questions came fast, calculated, designed to trip her up. They wanted her to slip, to say something they could use against her. But she didn't give them that satisfaction. And then, just when she thought she had them figured out, the real twist came. Someone she trusted, someone who had been in her corner from the very beginning, spoke up. And when they did, it wasn't to defend her. It was to betray her. Her mind reeled as she tried to process what had just happened. The words, the accusations, all coming from a voice she had never expected to turn against her. And just like that, everything she thought she knew was gone. Now, she wasn't just fighting them. She was fighting alone. She sat there stunned as the weight of the betrayal settled over her. The person she had trusted, the one who had stood beside her through every challenge, had just turned against her in front of everyone. The words they had spoken echoed in her mind, each one carefully chosen to damage her credibility, to dismantle everything she had built piece by piece. But as the silence stretched, she forced herself to breathe, to think. She couldn't afford to fall apart now, not when she was so close. They thought they had won. She could see it in their eyes. They expected her to break, to lash out, to give them exactly what they needed to push her out for good. But they had underestimated her. Instead of reacting, she leaned back, studying their faces. She could see it now, the nervous glances, the way some of them refused to meet her eyes. The betrayal had been planned, but not everyone in the room had known about it. There were cracks in their foundation, weak spots she could exploit. So she did the last thing they expected. She smiled. And then, calmly, she laid everything out. She spoke with precision, with control. She exposed the mistakes they had made, the flaws in their plan, the evidence she had gathered without ever letting them know she was watching. She turned the conversation around, forcing them to answer questions they had never prepared for. And then, just as she saw the first real flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, she delivered the final blow. She revealed the message she had received, the proof that someone else had been watching, someone who wasn't on their side. She watched the panic ripple through them, the realization that they had more to worry about than just her. Then came the twist none of them saw coming. Because she wasn't the only one who had been betrayed. As the tension thickened, a new voice entered the conversation, someone unexpected, someone they had never considered a threat. And in that moment, the entire balance of power shifted. She had been fighting alone for so long, she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have an ally. But she wasn't alone anymore, and neither were they. By the time the meeting ended, everything had changed. The ones who had tried to destroy her were now scrambling to protect themselves. The people who had stayed silent were starting to speak up. And she had done what they never thought she could. She had won. But as she walked out of that room, she knew this wasn't the end. Because the message she had received still lingered in her mind. You're not the only one watching. She had survived the battle, but the real game was just beginning. She stepped out of the building, the air crisp against her skin, her mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. The victory should have felt sweeter, but there was a weight to it, an unshakable awareness that the fight wasn't truly over. She had exposed them, turned their own tactics against them, but the message she had received kept echoing in her mind. She wasn't the only one watching. It wasn't a warning, it was a reminder. There were always others, people who worked behind the scenes, waiting, observing. Some were on her side, some weren't. And some were simply waiting to see how things would unfold before making their move. She knew better than to let her guard down. The moment people saw her as a real threat, the game would change again. But she wasn't afraid anymore. In the days that followed, the fallout was inevitable. Those who had orchestrated the plan against her scrambled to cover their tracks, but the damage was already done. She didn't even have to push once the cracks had formed. Everything started falling apart on its own. Some distanced themselves, pretending they had never been involved. Others doubled down, desperate to salvage what little power they had left. But the biggest shift wasn't in them. It was in the people who had stayed quiet for so long. She saw it in their eyes, in the way they started speaking up, pushing back against the same system that had tried to silence her. She had been fighting alone for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have support. But now, the change was real. And it was bigger than just her. Her work wasn't done. If anything, it was just beginning. But this time, she wasn't just proving something to them, she was proving it to herself. She had been told to stay in her lane. Now she was creating her own path.